Good day. In this video, I'm going to address the most common challenges building your answers and your stories going into a job interview. And by far, the number one challenge people face here is to estimate how long it's going to take to prepare them. Okay, so how long is going to take to prepare a story bank going into a job interview? And right from the start, you could easily build this within 30 seconds or less using my website, using an AI feature. However, from building the story bank to actually using it during the job interview, that's actually a long way to go, right? But on a more serious note here, I found that the best way to determine this would be a two-step process. The first step would be to answer the question on whether communication is your strength. Okay, so if communication is your strength going into a job interview, then the process of building your stories and your answers in the story bank will be relatively straightforward. Okay, if communication isn't your strength, then chances are it's going to take longer. Okay, how much longer? And this brings me to the second step of this estimation process. Usually, I recommend building your story bank through, let's say around 20 stories, and for each of those, you'd want to initially make a brain dump of 2-3 pages, which may take you on average 1 hour. Okay, so 20 hours of your time as an initial investment as a first version of your story bank. Okay, now since I have access to thousands of journeys of people building story banks, I can tell you that people won't spend more than 2-3 hours a day on this. So in order to invest 20 hours, you will likely need around 10 days to reach an initial version for your story bank, right? So this is excluding the revisions you'll automatically have to make, right? The number one trap candidates face early on in the process of building a story bank would be to overly simplify the process. So instead of that brain dump of several pages, to keep them in an Excel. Why invest 1 hour when you can invest 5 minutes to build them as bullet points? And this brings me to my first question: is communication your strength? Because after all, this is about improving your communication for the purpose of a job interview. Whereas by oversimplifying your answers, you're actually going in reverse, right, of improving your answers. Right, so this is why I'd strongly recommend you use a narrative format for this process, right? Executive roles, people who interview well will understand to what degree they should focus on those brain dumps. I've seen people who can easily make those bullet points, but these are rare, and these are exceptional communicators in the first place. The second common question, building answers and building your story bank in a job interview is: are my stories good enough? How do you know if your stories are good enough? And right from the start, I must tell you that this is a critically important skill you should build for yourself, because I don't think I've ever seen a candidate who relied on me or on AI to tell them if their stories were good as an indicator during their job interview. Right? So unless you build these critical thinking skills, you won't be able to pass interviews, right? But how do you determine still what are some indicators of your stories being good enough for these job interviews? And for this, I have a criteria that a formula that I built. So I've noticed that on average, if you revise your stories at least 3 times, then the quality of that story will significantly improve, and you can call those good enough. What do I mean by revisions? Could be making them, so transitioning from a brain dump into the STAR format, could be coaching, role play, right? And could be metrics and stuff like that. So could be, by the way, the STAR worksheet, okay, which, you could answer these follow-up and challenge questions, could be many other things. But if you revise them 3 times, you can be sure that you will have some really good outcomes, right? I've also implemented some quizzes in my training programs to help you to determine the level of proficiency with your behavioral interviewing skills, which may also be useful to determine, how good your critical thinking skills and your ability to self-assess really is, right? The third question people ask about building answers and preparing the job interviews is, do I have enough stories? Do I have enough material, content to go into a job interview? Am I future-proof? Not to have to come up with new stories on the spot. Here, how do you know you have enough stories? Well, basically, I recommend preparing on competencies or behaviors, so to speak. And the simplest example would be Amazon's now 16 leadership principles, which are core behaviors, right? So if you prepare 2-3 stories for each of those core behaviors, then you have enough content, enough meat, so to speak, to go into a job interview. Now, the challenge is that even if for Amazon's now 16 leadership principles, there are too many, right? So, and usually when you take any other model of behavioral competencies that's freely available out there, they're going to be long ones that are really hard to prepare. This is why I developed in my training program my own model of behavioral competencies, which simplifies the process as much as possible without oversimplifying it, right? I'm going to share it with you here on screen. It's nothing secret, but what you should understand is that oversimplifying your stories usually happens when you start answering lists of commonly asked questions. So people who prepare their job interviews solely or only by answering commonly asked questions will miss some of these key behaviors and will not have a complete story bank, so to speak. So this is the number one trap you want to avoid early on in building your story bank, that you should not rely on answering lists of commonly asked questions, because this doesn't work when compared to linking to models of behavioral competencies. Yes, you should answer lists of commonly asked questions, but this would be primarily with the goal of building your listening skills. Okay, so for example, how would you deal with conflict could also be answered by tell me about the time when you dealt with a conflict with your manager. Okay, so these are similar. So building your listening skills is something slightly different here. But how do you know you have enough stories? This is using this model of behavioral competencies. That's the most straightforward approach, and something which I'm quite proud of. I implemented in my training programs as well. And the fourth thing I like to talk about here, last but not least, is what if you cannot find stories on certain behaviors? Okay, for example, you cannot find stories around vision and strategic thinking. Okay, and the number one tip I can give you here is that it's always that your best stories will fit into multiple behaviors, but you have to get a little bit creative here. And what do I mean by creative? You'll have to zoom in and zoom out a little bit of those best experiences to find out something that fits into the behavior that you want it to fit in. For example, if you have a deep dive, which most candidates, it's impossible you don't have a deep dive as a great story. If you zoom out of that story, of that deep dive, chances are it's going to translate into a story of vision and strategic thinking, right? So zooming in, zooming out could be a trick that you can use to find enough story, right? So maybe as a closing note, communication is your ability to communicate is the determining factor of how complex this process will be. So if communication is a strength, basically, you brainstorm for those stories and you're good to go. If communication isn't your strength, I would also highly encourage you to do role play. So once you have your stories and you feel confident that they're strong, they're what you're looking for, try to role play. I'm not pitching my coaching services. You could also role play them by yourself. You could record yourself speaking them out loud, because you'll then notice some stuff you wouldn't otherwise while writing them, right? And by the way, there's also candidates who cannot make the difference, cannot make the distinction between writing stories and speaking them out loud. So role play is also critically important to improve your communication skills and the quality of your answers and stories going into job interviews. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.